Reserves Major Dan Feferman is a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute and an expert on Israel and Middle East security. He joins us now. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan.
Pleasure.
So let's start with the latest. Iran has released a photo of who they say is responsible for the attack on the Natanz nuclear facility. On the other hand, Israel has been accused of being responsible, and the timing with the nuclear talks in Vienna, is that a coincidence?
I don't think it's a coincidence at all. According to the Iranian state television, the man behind the attack, Reza Karimi, his photo was released, and they said he managed to flee the country shortly before the sabotage took place. It's actually the first time that Iranian authorities acknowledged that there was some kind of attack. They're saying there was an explosion that destroyed a few thousand centrifuges. Israeli reports are saying that it might have been some kind of cyber attack. It doesn't have to contradict here, because it could be that since Israel never took place and is allowing for deniability, Iran is scapegoating some individual, or if there was, as the reports hint, that there was some kind of Israeli involvement, this could be the person who collaborated. But honestly, we're probably not going to know, and it doesn't really matter who actually is responsible. It seems, obviously there's a lot of propaganda behind here. What's interesting is that the U.S. has not been overly critical of this so far, and this has to do with the timing. Either way, it definitely seems connected to the negotiations taking place right now in Vienna, and it seems to be an attempt to pressure Iran, to deter Iran, to maybe even actually slow down the program. There's two interesting scenarios I want to offer, and I've heard serious analysts offer both kind of scenarios as to the timing, as the coincidence. And one option is that Israel is working quietly behind the scenes to torpedo these talks, as some analysts think, that Israel is against any kind of talks that would leave Iran with any kind of nuclear capabilities. It doesn't trust Iranian compliance, and it wants to stick with the maximum pressure campaign introduced during the Trump administration. If this is the case, then Biden and the Biden administration, even though they have not criticized Israel publicly, are probably secretly furious with Israel. And the Europeans have been a little more open with their criticism. And then according to this scenario, Israel is going to continue to try to sabotage these talks, if it's Israel indeed behind these events, and try to get Iran to the point where it can't stay at the table. The other option is that the good cop, bad cop scenario, which I've seen other serious analysts raise, in that the U.S. is allowing Israel to conduct these kind of attacks with deniability, allowing Israel to be the bad cop in this scenario and to strengthen its hand and to raise the pressure. But either way, the timing does not seem to be coincidental.
So speaking of those nuclear talks, the U.S. is apparently at a hotel across the street from the one where the talks are taking place, since Iran has refused to include them. Do they have any input, and will their role in these negotiations grow at all?
Right. So the U.S. is going to be, it's across the street, and the Europeans are running kind of the mediator role in the meantime. And the issue now at hand is that Iran refuses to have the U.S. sit at the table so long as the U.S. does not drop the additional sanctions that were added during the Trump administration. I think the whole issue of the talks right now is how to get the U.S. and Iran back to the table, to some kind of framework. It is, even though there are some actors, maybe the Russians, maybe the Iranians themselves, certainly, who want the U.S. to have a less dominant role, it's going to be impossible to ignore the U.S.'s role in this due to their dominance over the global economy and financial systems. And so,
can you hear me?
And so for the U.S. Sanctions to be lifted, it's going to be critical to get the two back to the table.
Well, we don't know much about the progress of those talks as of yet, but Tehran's chief negotiator says new understanding appears to be emerging. What does he mean by that exactly, or what do you think he means by that?
Sure, it's a guessing game. We're talking about Abbas Araghchi, who is the chief Iranian negotiator in these indirect talks. At face value, and this is what we can take it right now, is that, and we know Iran has submitted some kind of text proposal to the U.S. side. They're trying to reach some kind of compromise with the Americans to get back to direct negotiations, to get everyone back to some kind of JCPOA framework. I think both sides here, the Americans and the Iranians, who I should point out, neither the Biden administration nor the Iranian regime is happy completely with the JCPOA. Both see it as a compromise that was painful but necessary, but both realize that there really isn't a better way forward. Iran is under a lot of domestic turmoil, a lot of pressure right now due to the state of its economy because of the sanctions and mismanagement and corruption that just, around the sanctions, it just exacerbated the effects of it. They have presidential elections coming up in June. Rouhani, the current president, and his foreign minister Zarif are both pragmatists, and they're gonna, pragmatists who are willing to work with the West, even if it's not comfortable for them, to try to save the regime, to try to save the economy, which is why Iran entered the JCPOA in the first place. But they have serious hardline opponents who want absolutely no cooperation and more conflict with the West, and are willing to take on the sanctions and the military pressure. So the question is how can both sides find some kind of choreography, let's say, some kind of timing that allows them to save face with their publics and come back to the formula that they can both agree on, which is more or less the JCPOA, Iran having somehow to drop the additional the additional enrichment that it's added since the U.S. dropped out of the JCPOA, and the U.S., of course, having to drop the additional sanctions that it added since it dropped out of the JCPOA.
Right. All right.
So the question is the timing and the choreography.
Okay, well, we await some interesting updates from Vienna. Dan Feferman, thank you very much.
Pleasure.